With shows like Bridgerton, The Gilded Age, and Sanditon, it really feels like we're coming into a historical fiction, sometimes more like historical fantasy, renaissance. And of course, to the surprise of absolutely nobody, Amazon obviously saw this and wanted a piece of that. So they began producing things like My Lady Jane. Of course, not that I'm mad about it. And in fact, it actually helps a lot that My Lady Jane actually has a really good plot and is really engaging. But as I was watching it for the first time, I did have to pause and ask myself, what are we doing and where in the world are we in the story? And it felt off-putting, unsettling, uneasy. And yet, I couldn't tear my eyes away. See, in storytelling, pacing and structure are one of the most fundamental yet heated topics among writers. How do we structure a story so that, to the audience, everything feels like a natural sequence of events that connect with each other, all leading up to a satisfying ending? People write books on it. They host seminars on it. There are classes on it. And My Lady Jane breaks all the rules in the most fun way possible. The thing is, the most basic structure of a screenplay is the 3-act structure. It's most often used for movies, in which you have a beginning, middle, and end. In other words, Act 1, Act 2, and Act 3. Setup, conflict, and resolution. Plot point 1, plot point 2 and midpoint, and plot point 3. This is the standard. And for so many people, it's the golden rule. And just because it's the standard doesn't mean that it's overdone. It's the standard for a reason. It works. Take the example of course, we're going to take the example of Bridgerton. Here's the example of Bridgerton Season 2. In Act 1, Anthony wants a practical marriage to Edwina, but her sister, Kate, is an obstacle. In Act 2, Anthony and Kate realize they have feelings for each other as Anthony courts Edwina, but neither are willing to act upon it. Act 3 begins when they're found out, and the marriage to Edwina is cancelled for obvious reasons, and to avoid scandal, they're forced to stay away from each other. Every act builds on the last one. Even if the characters find themselves in various different situations, doing various different things and feeling various different emotions, everything leads to Act 3. Everything builds towards it in some way. So even though Anthony and Kate go from enemies in Act 1 to trying to deny their feelings in Act 2 to unabashedly pining after each other in Act 3, everything feels cohesive because everything brings them from enemies to lovers. But just try to fit My Lady Jane into the 3-act block. If we tried to force it into that, it would look a little bit like Act 1, Jane needs to marry Guilford against her will, but wants a way out of it. Act 2, Jane becomes queen and seeks to find her cousin, the late king's murderers. Act 3, Jane needs to save herself from execution. It doesn't work. It's not cohesive, because what do any of these things have to do with each other? It's like we're shifting our focus between 3 entirely different plots, entirely different storylines. We think the story is going one way, and then suddenly we're somewhere completely different. And the way we thought the story was going gets put on the metaphorical back burner. If we try and go with the 3-act structure, after Act 1, the story's priority changes from a love story to one of political intrigue. In the middle of Act 2, at our midpoint, we shift away from finding Edward's quote-unquote killers to trying to bridge segregation laws between humans and Ethians, shapeshifters. At the end of Act 2, we're trying to escape execution. So we're always on our toes, trying to figure out what happens next, trying to find and continue the main storyline, and never getting it right. So what about the 5-act structure? This structure is often used in 1-hour TV dramas, which feels much more suited to the format of Our Lady Jane, right? The 5-act structure is the one most of us also learn in schools. It's Freytag's pyramid, and it's also incredibly common in storytelling. People often say the 3-act structure is used because it's simpler and can be achieved within the length of a movie, whereas the 5-act structure is longer and is thus more suitable to something like a TV series or a play. In Romeo and Juliet, Act 1, the exposition introduces our main characters. The inciting incident launches us into Act 2, when Juliet and Romeo meet. Act 2, the rising action, is their courtship. And Act 3, the climax, is when Romeo watches Mercutio die and slays Tybalt, inciting a full-on war between the Montagues and the Capulets. Act 4, the falling action, is when Romeo and Juliet both take poison and die.
Cheers to my love.
Act 5, the resolution, ends with the truce between the Capulets and the Montagues. Freytag's method stems from a single conflict. In Romeo and Juliet, it's the feud between the Capulets and the Montagues. The plot is based around this single conflict, which comes to a satisfying end, sometimes a very tragic end, in Act 5. If we try and use the 5-act structure in My Lady Jane, what would even be our central conflict? It's not Jane wanting to be free in episode 1, because she eventually no longer wants a divorce and has a desire to stay queen for specific reasons. It's not finding a cure for Guilford's Etheanism. That very quickly shifts away from the focus of the story. It's not trying to end division laws between Ethians and Verities, because even though this is central to the story, very little of the exposition or rising action would have led up to it. It's not even trying to arrest, kill, or dethrone Mary, because that's also introduced much too late. Instead, they're all conflicts central to My Lady Jane. And unlike the very straightforward structure of Freytag's pyramid, they're all interconnected. We can't use a circular structure because Jane doesn't return to her normal life at the end of the season. There's no central conflict which Jane solves and then gets her back to her normal life. And there's way too much going on for her to go back to that. We can't quite use the Save the Cat method either, because it's an extension of the 3-act structure. But if we were to try, then likely Jane's story with all its chaotic wiles would be our A-plot, and Edward's story would be our B-plot. But think about the major pieces of Save the Cat. Our whole Act 1, which is supposed to introduce the world, instead spurs us into action. How is Jane going to get out of this marriage to Guilford and earn her freedom? The entirety of Act 1 seemingly leads nowhere in the story. She still ends up marrying Guilford, and propelling us into Act 2, seemingly totally out of left field, is that she becomes queen of all things. Our bad guys close-in moment, somewhere in the midpoint of the show, would be when Jane realizes Mary poisoned Edward, and then Mary strangles Jane, taking away her proof. But then, Jane wakes up immediately in the following episode, and then she's seemingly able to solve this by the end of the episode, when Mary is forced to run away. Our break into Act 3 would be when Jane is captured and Mary returns to take the throne, but our resolution from that would not be because of Jane herself, but because of everyone around her, as we'll come to see. I think the closest structure we could model to fit the eccentric and totally unpredictable pacing in My Lady Jane would be the Fichtean curve, where our main character goes through crisis after crisis after crisis after crisis, all leading up to the climax, and then falling into the falling action. But even these crises, they seemingly have little to do with each other. But even though it's not perfect, we do start to realize from this that My Lady Jane has elements of pretty much all of these structures in some way. Jane does go from a girl to a queen to execution and rebellion in 3 big blocks, technically. There is a climax to the story in her execution. She does go through crises all the time. But none of these structures fit, because this show, kind of like Jane herself, breaks all the rules. And rule breaking in storytelling is unsettling to the viewer. We subconsciously expect things to be done a certain way, for stories to follow a certain path. When a character has a big aha moment, that must be leading into a new act, a new resolution, or something new. And that is why it's so unsettling, so strange that more than literally any protagonist I can think of, Jane has literally way too many aha moments to even keep track of. And even so, Jane fails constantly at them. If a character-driven story is led by the actions of the main character and their consequences, My Lady Jane breaks that rule so much that it forces the viewer to expect the unexpected. So much of the story is completely reliant on the other characters and their decisions, and them helping her, or stopping her, and yet Jane remains an active, not passive protagonist, even though she keeps failing at all her ideas.
Jane fails constantly.
So suddenly we have this large, full world of characters where characters make decisions and they fail, and then they make more decisions and then fail some more. And then they influence the other characters and try to get by the skin of their teeth. And we come to a totally different structure that's completely new, completely not what we're used to, and impossible to tear our eyes away from. We've seen all these other diagrams, right, of various other structures. Well, My Lady Jane looks like this. And what makes things even more interesting is that we can take a look at this structure like this, from a broad point of view. And it looks like this massive roots almost, where pieces branch from each other, some are separate entirely, but eventually relate back to the main story. And yet they all bring us to a conclusion in one way or another. There's only one end. When we look at the structure from this broad point of view, we do see that there is structure. Everything in the story relates to each other, even if it's not immediate or linear or obvious. We start at the beginning, we hit a bunch of different events, and then we get to the end. And maybe that's all the structure we need. But maybe we follow one path, and then it just ends. And suddenly something from way before, something really small sometimes, something we might have even forgotten, suddenly grows and takes over the story from another branch, another root, just like what would happen in an actual plant. But that's not all. We don't have to look at this structure so broadly. We can look at what individual episodes do too, and we can realize that the episodes themselves also have something so interesting, so unpredictable about them. The way each one is built actually varies a lot. Take episode 1. The whole episode consists of Jane looking for ways to get out of her marriage to Guilford. And so she makes these constant plans, puts them into action, leads us to kind of believe that they'll actually work. And then each plan fails, and she ends up marrying him anyways. So we have all these branches that seemingly lead nowhere for a full episode. In any other story, this would be filler. This would be seen as useless, as making up random things to amp up drama or fill up time. But in My Lady Jane, it works. It keeps us engaged even though Jane keeps failing. And what's so clever is that this is our introductory episode, and having this format actually is such an original way to introduce us to all of our eventual characters and plot lines. Whether it be running away with Susanna, which leads us to get introduced to the Ethian versus Verity conflict of the story, or trying to convince the Dudleys to stop the marriage, which introduces us to both Stan and Lord Dudley. Or even visiting the king, which gives us a natural segue into discovering about the plot to poison Edward, and introducing us to him as our B-story supporting character. Just like the roots of a plant, each seemingly dead end is actually a center of growth, from which new branches, new plots can grow and spread, even sometimes overtake the story. But then we move on to episode 3, and we think we know what to expect, right? Jane's gonna try a couple things out, fail a bit, and then we'll move on. But then the structure of the show changes, because episode 3 is pretty much linear, and it's split into 2 main parts between Jane and Edward's stories. Essentially, all episode 3 does is set us up so that Jane is named Queen, and then everything basically switches. Because up until that point, our focus had been on Jane's marriage to Guilford, and suddenly it becomes a political royal drama. But because it's linear, the drama suddenly feels amped up. The stakes are high and we feel the pressure of it as a viewer, because it feels like we're headed somewhere very specific in the story. And we're charging there head on. And then in the case of episode 4, we see another change in structure. Because in episode 4, 2 storylines, namely Jane trying to figure out who killed Edward and Mary trying to kill Jane, do something we haven't seen before. They actually loop together and join by the end of it, where both characters meet, and Jane gives up her proof of Mary's guilt to save Guilford, and then Mary chokes her, fully revealing Mary for who she is in front of Jane.
Abdicate or die, Jane.
It's a loop between the 2 storylines. Then, in episodes 7 and 8, we call back to our first episodes. We have Jane constantly branching out different ideas, constantly failing in episode 7, trying everything to escape execution just to end up on the chopping block anyways. Literally. And then episode 8 is pretty much linear again, and incorporating every character in it, giving our road to the ending so much more punch, but also tying into the very start of the show in a roundabout way. And all these switches and changes in structure make us, as viewers, subconsciously on the edge of our seats. Because we don't know what'll happen next. We don't even know what or who we're going to see on the screen at any given moment. And for a show that's all about twists and turns and being a bit of a rebel and breaking all the rules, of course, something as fundamental as its own pacing and its own timeline is going to be the same way. And that is why the pacing of My Lady Jane and the way it's laid out is so different from anything we've seen in other TV series. And yet, it fits in perfectly with everything else about the show. Chaotic, eccentric, and fun. And it shows us that even though there are so many tried and true ways to structure a story, these are not the only ways to do so. And sometimes, when we deviate from it, when we have a clear view of what we want to do with our story, whether a book, movie, or TV series, our result can be completely original, completely new, and become one of its biggest strengths. So My Lady Jane teaches us a very important lesson in a lot of ways. As writers, we put so much pressure on ourselves to write this perfect story. But isn't the whole goal of storytelling to push the boundaries a bit? leave some rough edges, and just have some fun with it.